Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Cool shoes. My brother would love those.
Ooh, I don't share my sources.
Well, I just found them using Circle to search with Google on my new Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 6.
What?
And I texted them to my brother on the other side of this massive screen.
Where did you get that phone?
Lucky for you, I don't gatekeep my sources. Tell them.
Get your own Galaxy Z Fold 6 now at Samsung.com. Requires internet connection. Results may vary by uniqueness, clarity, and framing of circled image and related factors.
Looking to invest? Start your journey by exploring exchange-traded funds with Global X ETFs. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs for short, create baskets of stocks, bonds, and other assets that you can buy in a single trade. Global X specializes in ETFs that track emerging trends, like the rise of artificial intelligence, as well as strategies aimed to generate income potential. Visit globalxetfs.com to discover how you can get started.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, the podcast where we try to understand those driving factors making our world so mad. As the mega orderers will know, we talk a lot about overt disorderers, how they act, why they act. But we haven't spent much time on the conceptual link between autocracy and disorder. On the one hand, you might think autocrats, especially fascists, they would crave order. They would try to promote order at home and abroad. But the reality is quite different, and history certainly tells us a different story. Autocrats tend to feel more secure at home when the world around them is disordered. However, they also do another thing. They put an extreme emphasis on hierarchical relationships of power, trust, and loyalty in their society. They focus on the symbolism of things like deference. And by cultivating this symbolism of order, they're actually not focusing on how a society's economy works. How does its foreign relations work? We had a truly brilliant episode on how tyranny functions with Marcel Dirsus. If you haven't heard that episode, you might want to check it out. You can get to it via the link in the show notes. It lays a lot of the conceptual groundwork for today's more narrative episode. So with that housekeeping out of the way, we're doing something a little different with this episode. We are investigating a psychological, a personal look at what is it like to experience life inside a dictatorship, inside a chaotic situation, and what does that tell us about our disordered world? To go on this journey, I'm extremely happy and more than a bit honored to have on our show Jordan Harbinger. Jordan is a Wall Street lawyer turned podcaster whose wildly successful The Jordan Harbinger Show was awarded Apple Podcast's most downloaded new show of 2018. If you believe the saying that great minds think alike, great podcasting minds definitely host the same guests. And Jordan has had on some of my absolute favorites, from my friend Jamie Metzel to my really, really close friend Brian Klass to my mega crush Bill Browder. So despite Jordan's show being rather different from our own, I think the mega orderers will enjoy it, and they should go to the link in the show notes to check out, topics from divorce law to the birth control pill. Jordan, welcome to Disorder. Did you know that we share something very unique in common? We've both been kidnapped twice.
Oh, you've been kidnapped twice? So, is this an online conversation or an off-mic conversation?
I don't know. I'm going to say I'll tell you mine if you tell me yours.
Sure. I want to keep it fast, though, because I feel like, one, I've told the 2-hour-long versions on my own show, and two, some people might not care. Yeah, sure. The first time was a fake taxi. I was in Mexico City. I was 20 years old. I'm 44 now, so it gives you kind of an idea of when that was. I was living in the outskirts of Mexico City. I was supposed to meet my friend at a bar. I went outside, dressed up kind of nicely. I got into a taxi, a green Volkswagen Beetle, because all the Mexico City taxis kind of were that. And as we were driving, I told the guy, look, I don't have any cash. I need to go to an ATM. And he was like, no problem. And Mexico City's kind of bowl-shaped. If you're going down towards the middle, you're going down into the bowl. You're going towards the city center, towards the presidential palace. That's kind of where the bar was that I was meeting my friend at. But if you're going up, you're going outside to the outskirts of the city. And it's one of those places where as you move further away from the center, the worse it gets. And I noticed we were going in that direction. And I wasn't brand new to the city. I don't know if this guy just thought like, oh, he's visiting random people in this suburban neighborhood. I don't know what his mindset was, but he didn't know that I knew the city. And he just kept driving out. And this is kind of before cell phones. Like, you could get like a little Nokia or something, but it was pretty rare. Most people didn't have them. And so I wasn't distracting myself with Instagram or Candy Crush or anything like that. I was looking out the window, and I remember my mind, I was trying to convince myself that, oh, it's because of traffic, because of an accident. And then it was like, well, let me ask him. Is it because of traffic or an accident? And he's like, no, I'm just going to ask for directions. And I was like, oh, man, major red flag. This is like if you're in Washington, D.C., and you're driving away from the White House. If you've been a taxi driver here for more than half a day, you know how to get to this place, right? So I don't believe that you don't know how to get to the center of Mexico City as a taxi driver. That is an impossible thing to believe.
My kidnapping story in Syria and Lebanon, and when I say Syria and Lebanon, it's because I started the journey in Aleppo and was supposed to go to Beirut, but got kidnapped somewhere crossing the anti-Lebanon mountains, has the aspect of knowing where I was going and the cabbie turning off to a different road. Hey, wait, we're in Lebanese Tripoli. We need to go south to get to Beirut. Why did he make a left turn? Why are we going east? Why are we going up into the mountains? But then there was another great resonance, is that it was also in those years, 2004-ish, where people had Nokia flip phones. I had a Nokia flip phone, but my Syrian phone, because there was no roaming or whatever, if you had a Syrian chip in your phone, it simply didn't work because we'd crossed the border, and there was no way that I could call anyone. And then the last interesting overlap, without getting into the whole why Kurdish rebels who worked for Öcalan tried to kidnap us, but the similar analogy is it has the issue of the ATM machine. What I needed to do once the guys with the guns and the AK-47s came and we were on the side of this mountain was convince them that to pay the ransom, we needed to go to an ATM machine, which is how I lured them to take us back to Beirut. So I will stop there and say maybe circa 2004 kidnapping stories are all similar.
I'd like to think this was just going to be an express kidnapping where guys were going to get in the car and rob me, take me to some ATMs, and that was the end of it. But you don't really know, right? You could also be held for ransom. You could also be chopped up into little pieces by some sort of weird cult. Like, you just don't know. You don't really want to roll the dice on that one. So I told him to stop and let me out. He was like, no way. I realized I couldn't open the door because it was sort of rigged to unlock by him. Like the locks would go below the threshold of the door. You couldn't pick the lock up. So I was like, man, just, take me wherever you want to go. I'll pay you. And he's like, no, we're almost there. I was like, well, that's definitely not true. And we're in this like really dark area. So finally he stops in front of this like cinder block, half finished house, like the kind they have in the Middle East. And I was like, this is it. This is the place where nobody can hear you scream. There's probably guys in there waiting for him. He couldn't call them in advance, so they weren't waiting outside, but he was going to get out of the car and go get them. And I was like, do not get out of the car. I moved to sit behind him, and I put my arm between him and the seat. He didn't notice that. So he made kind of a fast one for the door, because I was like, do not get out of the car. Keep driving. And he was like, relax, and he made a fast one for the door, but I was able to pull him in, and then I was able to pull him into the seat. Now, bear in mind, again, I'm 20 years old. All I'm doing is eating carne asada all day and working out twice a day because it was like the gym. It was hard to make friends. My friends were at the gym. I was really just like 205 pounds of just like muscle. So I pull this guy into the seat, and he starts to struggle, but he is just weak. And I squeezed my forearm over his nose and mouth until he stopped moving. And then I opened the door on his side, yanked him out, pushed him out of the car, squeezed myself between the two seats, tried to drive a stick shift from 1967, failed, took the keys out, chucked him because I didn't want him to just like get up from whatever sort of sleeper. He probably was going to wake up in a few seconds. I didn't want him to get up, turn the car around and come and run me over or come and get me again. And I just ran back as far as I could remember we had driven, which was, you can only remember like 3 or 4 turns. You're like left, right. Oh, crap, I can't remember the rest. So, I just sort of ran towards where I thought there would be traffic. And I finally hit a road with cars. And of course, no one's stopping, right? I mean, I'm like this sweaty gringo wearing Banana Republic chinos that are like wet at the, in all the wrong places. And then finally someone stops and is like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, help. Because I start yelling in English because I was yelling in Spanish and everyone was like, nope. But then when you're yelling in English, people are like, okay, this is weird. And this guy was like a doctor and a younger woman. They stop, and I'm like, I gotta get me out of here. And he's like, you're not getting in my car? And I was like, please, you gotta get me out of here. I'll ride in the trunk. And I think that desperate, I will ride in the trunk, just open the trunk. I think he was like, okay, this is like not a trick. Like this guy desperately needs help if he's willing to just climb in a stranger's trunk because it's safer, which I was. He let me get in the car, and I was like, take me to the police station. And he was like, no, because you just told me you possibly murdered a cab driver, and the police are possibly in on whatever kidnapping scheme is going on. This is Mexico, man. And he's like, where do you live? Actually, I don't want to know. I'll drop you off at a metro station. He's like, my free advice to you is to get out of this town forever. So I basically just like moved after that to Guadalajara, and I never went back to Mexico City. Now, I have checked with law enforcement contacts in Mexico. My name is not in any databases. There are no arrest warrants out for me, so I assume homeboy woke up on the sidewalk and was like, oh, probably shouldn't have robbed the gringo that was twice my size. Maybe I'll get in the car and go look for somebody else. And I also wonder if he went back to the place where he picked me up being like, where's that guy that choked me out? But I only went back to that place to get all my stuff. Like, I left that house in the middle of the night, and the family was like, where are you? And I was like, I wrote them basically like a note, and I was like, hi, I moved to Guadalajara at 4 o'clock in the morning because there was a bus leaving at like 6 or something from the main station. Thanks for everything. Bye. And the daughter called me and was like, what the hell, man? And I was like, I had a problem and I had to leave. And she's like, I work at the presidential palace. I can straighten out anything. And I was like, yeah, maybe we'll work on that. But in the meantime, I don't think I should stay at the place where the guy picked me up who tried to kidnap me that I later choked out and possibly almost killed. So I'm good.
Wow. Great story.
Yeah.
Amazing energy. You will find it unsurprising, mega orderers, that my kidnapping story requires and has no aspect of physical strength or courage. I merely was able to be unkidnapped through words of persuasion and convincing the kidnappers that I was in fact on their side, and we very much wanted to support Kurdish independence and the guys in AK-47s who asked for a contribution. But the moment is not about me. Why is it that all kidnapping stories seem to end where you're like, oh, I need to get to a place where there are lots of people or crowds, and then I'm going to scream something, and despite my knowledge of Arabic or your knowledge of Spanish, you conclude, actually, if I scream in English and I run towards people who seem to be authorities, somehow this will work out better for me. So, I mean, what I take away from this genre of story, having heard a few of them now, is that such stories happen actually less frequently than they could, is because there is a degree of international order. There is a degree to which we randomly trust people who we give money to or we engage in business transactions to. And we take for granted how ordered, in fact, our world is. No?
I agree with that. You know, it's funny. This is a very sort of timely conversation for me because I just got back from a wedding in Georgia, not the Peach State, the place that gets invaded by Russia every decade. And it was absolutely incredible. It was some of the most fun I've ever had, like, in my entire life, actually. I'm not a wine guy, but I was like, I'll start, whatever, when in Rome. And I'm like, oh, this is what really good wine tastes like. And in Georgia, as you know, they feed you like a bottle of wine with each course, basically. They just keep refilling the decanter or whatever it's called. So 3-4 of us, you know, you basically each drink a bottle or two of wine by the end of the meal. And it was amazing. I mean, we were in this rural hotel in the middle of nowhere. But the reason that this is relevant is the reason the wedding was in Georgia is because my brother, who's German, has German citizenship. He was marrying a girl from Belarus. Well, she lives in Slovakia, but she's from Belarus. And her parents are from Belarus. They live in Slovakia as well. But all of the other guests, they were from Belarus. And Georgia's one of the only places that they can actually go
100%.
that isn't, I think, Russia without a visa. And so these women had never left the country, and they were kind of like, this travel is amazing. And I'm thinking to myself, Georgia is a little chaotic. Like, I wouldn't take an American for their first trip abroad to Georgia, for example.
It's not just Middle Eastern with post-Soviet infrastructure. No one speaks English, and it's a very, very poorly organized place.
Yes. The cars there that you see, the Germans were mind blown. They were like, that car is missing the front end.
Yes.
And most of the cars here are missing. We were driving down the road, and it's like, you'll see someone pass on the wrong side of the road on a blind mountain turn.
Not only that,
overtake
sometimes
two
with
trucks.
the steering wheel on the wrong side of the car. Because
Yes,
they drive
exactly.
Japanese cars there that have British side steering, even though
Yes.
they drive on the American/continental side of the road.
Correct. And they'll take that blind pass, overtake, turn, whatever you want to call it, at like 80 miles an hour. And you're thinking, you don't know that no one's coming. You're just kind of hoping that no one's coming. And when someone does come, they slide in between the other two trucks, like with 3 inches of clearance, and everybody brake checks everyone else. It's insane.
I have been to Georgia more than 15 times and have taken many tourists on these wine tours that I run. So I have been in very harrowing experiences there. But back to global order and disorder, I think Georgia points out something that you were getting to, but I am going to package in my way.
Please do.
We are so far from the state of nature in California or London or elsewhere that even when we have inklings of what the primordial Hobbesian war of all against all world might be, and how in that world you really do trust family and you're very hospitable to strangers because you know that when you go to the other village, shit may not work or whatever. It's extremely alien from our more curated lives, and that those experiences, be they in Syria or Georgia, are useful contrasts to tell us key things about human nature.
That's a good way to put it. I think I'm a little bit less poetic in how I package things. I was more thinking along the lines of these women who had never left Belarus really made me thankful to be an American, because living in a country that is a disorderer, as you put it, and Belarus I think probably counts as one of those, is a totally different experience that even as somebody who, look, I lived in the former East Germany. I've traveled to North Korea several times. I used to run tours to North Korea, probably like you ran tours to Georgia. It's not a wine tour. It's a slightly different animal, but and it became illegal. And I would ask these women things, and they would answer me, and they would say, hey, you should come to Minsk. It's going to be so fun. We'll show you around. And I was like, oh, I would love to go there, but I don't think that I can because I'm kind of a journalist in the United States. I talk about Putin and things like that. Now's really not a good time. Last time I tried to go to Belarus, literally 20 years ago, I got arrested because I didn't have a visa. And I was one of those like 18-year-old Americans who's like, yeah, you just get on the train and you go to the different country. And they're like, oh, America, have fun. And Belarus was like, oh, where's your visa? And I was like, what visa? Can I just get one for like $20? And they were like, no, but you can go to jail for the weekend. And I was like, oh, okay. That's my first and only experience with Belarus. So I'm not super keen to go there. When we were having a drink one night, we were using Google Translate because my Russian is crap and their English was sort of non-existent. And I said something like, hey, I'd love to visit you guys once your crazy dictator is all said and done with. And instead of just saying that and showing it on my phone, I sent it to the group chat in Telegram. And the mood immediately was like, oh, and someone was asking someone else, and then somebody asked the bride's father, like, what do we do? And he's like, delete that. You got to delete it for everyone in the chat, and everyone's chat has to have that deleted. And so then everybody cleared the chat and deleted the chat and archived the chat. And I was like, oh, I did a thing that could get all of these people thrown in prison. And then one of the guys who spoke English was like, man, I got a friend who's in jail because somebody sent him a picture of a cop and somebody replied with a poop emoji, the smiley poop emoji. And they're like, he's in jail now. And I'm just like, oh my God. And he said, the worst thing is you can be in a group chat where somebody sends a picture of a cop and somebody replies with a poop emoji and you're not even talking in there and you go to jail anyway because they know you know those people.
And in fact, you should have known better. But let's pivot. So you mentioned North Korea. I've obviously never been to North Korea, but I'm fascinated by the fact that you led tours there. Tell us, what does North Korea tell us about the kind of archetypical dictatorship? What are the things that you experienced, insights that it gives you?
Yeah, look, North Korea is so far from anything that I can imagine existing on Earth, right? The guys and gals, I should say, in Belarus, they have Telegram, they have cell phones, they have internet. They know what they're missing in some ways. They don't talk about it because they don't want issues. North Koreans, they don't have a clue. Even some of the most privileged North Koreans who've, say, been to China on business trips and things like that, they just don't get it. Like the closest thing some of my friends in North Korea were saying was, I know you have more in the United States, but you're super privileged and you're in the top 1%. And I'm like, well, maybe I am, but like this 19-year-old backpacker who's on the tour, that guy's not a 1%er. His parents are also not 1%ers. He probably spent a month of his salary or whatever on this tour, maybe a little less, but like this is not a rich person. And they can't believe that because the only people in North Korea who are even allowed to get passports are essentially diplomats and the Elon Musk type figures of the regime are the only people who are ever allowed to leave without supervision of any kind. And most people have never been allowed to leave. And if they have, they go to China on a business trip, they stay in the hotel and they're with their minders from the security services the whole time. And they don't really get to do anything outside of the group. And it was terrifying. You know, you fly in and you feel it right away. You get on the plane and the in-flight magazine is like, why Kim Jong-il is amazing and all the amazing things that are happening courtesy of the great leader. And there's so many microcosms of the whole thing. So I took the magazine and I needed to write a note about something and I borrowed a pen. I was seated next to a North Korean, which almost never happens, but they were like, okay, well, there's one seat left and you need to sit next to this guy. So I sit next to this guy and I borrow a pen from him, and I go to write on a piece of paper, not the magazine, a piece of paper that I set on top of the magazine, and he was like, no, because he knew that the pressure from the pen on the paper would go through to the in-flight magazine onto the picture of the leader, and he was like, do not do that. He was like, dude, absolutely not. And so I got the picture, I flipped the magazine over to write on the other side, and he was like, no, don't do that. So I end up writing on the table, but it's bumpy, so it looks like crap. And I'm just thinking like, wow. I get to the hotel, and I put the magazine down, and it's taking up a lot of space on the table. So I put the ashtray on top of it. I put my coins in the ashtray, and I come back, and my room has been cleaned. The magazine is gone. The ashtray is where I left it. The coins are where I left it in the ashtray. And I'm like, they took the magazine. And why did they take the magazine? They said we could keep it. It's not something you can't keep. You can't keep it if you're going to not treat it, with the respect or whatever that it deserves. So I went to the front desk and I said, hey, I think they took my magazine. I'd like to keep it as a souvenir. And they were like, oh, are you in room whatever? I was like, yes. And they go, yes, we took the magazine. They handed it to me in like a nice like manila envelope. They're like, you need to keep it in here for the rest of the trip. Basically like, don't even fold this thing. Because that's not what you do with the magazines that have Kim Jong-un's face on it. And that was a microcosm of just about everything. I mean, we had somebody who wanted to get a picture of it was at the time new, Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung statues together. They unveiled this thing, and it was massive, and we were close, and he wanted to get the whole thing in his camera lens, and he didn't have the right focal length. So he kind of like laid down, and our guide was like, hey, get up. And another guide came over and was like, you don't lay down in front of our leader. You don't lay down. What are you doing? And it was like, oh, he's just trying to get a good picture. Like, we really had to be like, he's trying to get a good picture. There's no disrespect intended. It's really, he's got to make himself uncomfortable in order to get the magnificence of the great leader all in one photo. Because you can't even take you're not allowed to have a photo where, say, the body of the leader is cut off. If they make a statue and it's the whole body, you have to have the whole thing. You can't have one where the arm is missing or the legs are missing. You can't have one with the heads missing. You can't do it.
As alien as this may sound to our listeners, I think it's not as alien in our symbolic past that whether it's early Christianity or Islam, there have always been taboos. And in fact, the past is a foreign country, and we do understand these issues of social taboo. The extent of the totalitarianism is new. Do you know what I mean? It required a Stalin-esque or North Korea-esque situation for it to reach that level. But we can connect to the issue of social taboo. What I want to ask you is, having spent time in North Korea, is it a genuine geopolitical threat either to the U.S. or to South Korea? Or is it just this quirky, incompetent hermit kingdom? Because when you hear these quirky stories, it makes it sound actually not that much of a security threat.
Right. So the quirky stories it's funny. They do so much to try and combat the quirky stories. But really, my personal opinion is they should probably lean into it. Now, I'm not going to give North Korea any advice, right? I stopped running tours there a while ago. I sold all my assets and everything. But the quirky stories do keep us going, oh, look at this hopeless backwater that doesn't have enough electricity for even the capital city. What a joke. The soldiers are starving and don't have ammunition and their hair's falling out. That stuff is true. But yeah, they're a threat. They have nukes, man, and they have a lot of artillery pointed at the south, and there's nothing you can really do about it. I mean, even if there was some crazy blitz where we had marked like 95% of their artillery and taken all of it out, that 5% or whatever that makes it through, that is going to hit skyscrapers in Seoul that are full of people that couldn't even get to the elevator or stairs in time to take cover. So no, there's going to be like 2 million dead people. And even if there's not 2 million, let's say it's only 200,000. That's insane.
Of course.
Right? And that would happen probably inside of a few hours. You know, we take out the other artillery.
And this is an important point, just to clarify what Jordan is referencing here. Even before North Korea had a nuclear capacity, they had been cultivating a tremendous amount of artillery. And given the proximity of Seoul to the DMZ, they could do a Dresden-like thing of bombing and artillery, having the massive human cost that you mentioned. So how do you feel about South Korea pursuing an independent nuclear deterrent? Because they're worried about hedging against the uncertainties of a potential Trump presidency. Is that rational? Should South Korea be cultivating their own massive military deterrent?
I mean, probably. As unfortunate as it is, I would love to not have nuclear proliferation for obvious reasons, but it seems like if they can't count on the U.S. nuclear umbrella, that's a big problem, and the U.S. Navy and all of these other things that we would need to do in order to blockade and stifle and deter any attack from North Korea. Sure, they kind of need that. It's unfortunate because this is sort of the big mistake. You know, we had Annie Jacobson on the Jordan Harbinger Show about nuclear war. There's no such thing as kind of a regional nuclear conflict. It doesn't really work that way. She explains it much better than I'm going to, but essentially, you can't just have a thing where, oh, this is the Korean Peninsula. Only, North Korea fires on the south and it's a massive humanitarian disaster because the south fires back. So Pyongyang and Wonsan and all these cities are completely flattened and Seoul's completely flattened and Busan is done. But that then triggers a response from the U.S., which might trigger a response from China, which might trigger a response from Russia. I mean, even in the example she gave on the show, which was, I think, the United States and Russia, nukes have to go flying over North Korea in order to hit certain targets in Russia from the United States. And North Korea can't tell if we're aiming at Russia or at them, right? They just see an ICBM coming on the radar. So what do? They launch. And there's you can't recall nukes after launch, apparently. They're also analog because otherwise they're vulnerable to cyber threats and things like that. So once they're launched, that's it, man. If you find out that you launched them because of a cloud thing, oh well, you just triggered Armageddon.
I want to ask you something because of the scenario you sketched there whereby China and Russia and stuff become involved. Obviously, North Korea can only exist in the format that it does because the Chinese protect it and subsidize its trade and whatever.
Yes.
And North Korea now is back in the headlines for providing all these artillery shells that the Russians use in Ukraine. Like they have a large defense industry in ways that even the Russians can't do those things. But why do the Chinese want it to continue the way that it does? How does it help them in their great power politics when it's so destabilizing?
Right. So this is actually quite interesting. I thought this was kind of common knowledge-ish, but the more I learn about it, the more I realize that it's more complex than it looks. So China needs North Korea for a couple of key reasons, and I'm going to leave out sort of the minor reasons. The major reasons are, one, for all the propaganda that says South Korea is a puppet government of the United States, that North Koreans say that all the time, they're not 100% wrong. Like puppet government, not really, but strongly allied with the United States, a massive economic powerhouse, yes. So the last thing that the Chinese want is South Korea right on their border. That's no good, right? That would be almost like having it'd be like having Singapore times 100 on their border. They don't want that, right? It's a shining beacon of economic prosperity. You're going to have U.S. influence. You're going to have U.S. military that's already there. That is just not a good thing for China.
It would almost be like if Ukraine succeeded and became a democracy, and
Correct.
they all spoke a form of a Slavic language that almost all Russians can understand, and they had democracy.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like, hey, this is what you could have, but you don't. Gee, I wonder why. Come and look at it. It's right across the river. Use your binoculars. You could even come take a look for yourself. Wow, we're 50 years in the future from where you are over here in Dandong and the eastern provinces of China. So there's that. But the other reason is German reunification, East and West Germany, is a massive project. Not was, because it's still ongoing, even though it's been, I don't know, what are we on, 35 years?
Oh, correct. I mean, the rise of the AfD shows us that the reunification has lots of flaws to it.
It does, right. So you end up with these right-wing parties. You end up with these parties that say, hey, and when I was there in the 90s, living in the former East, teachers weren't paid the same. The infrastructure wasn't the same. I mean, they had basically only cleaned up the most egregious stuff, like factories that spewed out raw sulfuric acid gas and had dripping sulfuric and hydrochloric acid into, like, the river. They had basically sold that to Dow Chemical and been like, you fix this and make it suitable for the 21st century, and we'll let you use it. And there were factory cities and things like that. They cleaned up the air. The trees apparently used to be gray, my friends all said, and then when they reunified, you can't come up with a better metaphor for things went from black and white to color. So that was the German project. And Germans are sort of notoriously efficient. They've got plans. They've got a lot of money. They had a lot of money coming from other countries. What happens when you have reunification with North and South Korea, except North Korea is way behind where East Germany was in the 80s and 90s. There's no comparison between malnourished North Korea, where you can specialize in Kim Il-sung philosophy and maybe some kind of engineering if you're lucky, but you have to go to Africa to go to college to learn it. I mean, there's no comparison. So what happens when you have 25 million people who are essentially only useful as laborers, with a very tiny single-digit % of people that could maybe theoretically get a job doing something kind of useful in a modern economy? And then you have 1 million or whatever of active duty soldiers that don't have bullets, aren't educated, and their hair is falling out. Like, what are you going to do with that population? You can make a manufacturing powerhouse, sure, but you're going to have a stratified society. But what happens to those people? Do some go off looking for a better future? Sure, they go to South Korea and do that. But what happens when that sort of fills up and is saturated? They go into China as refugees. Right now, they get shot if they go over the border, and China sends them back if they arrest them. What happens when they arrest them and they send them back, and North and South reunified Korea says, yeah, well, okay, they can live here. It's a free country. And they just cross the river again. You've got an unstoppable flow of refugees right on your border with pretty much nothing you can do about it unless you're just willing to execute people who come in without a visa.
After the break, more with Jordan Harbinger. Is it Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow?
Cool shoes. My brother would love those.
Ooh, I don't share my sources.
Well, I just found them using Circle to search with Google on my new Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 6.
What?
And I texted them to my brother on the other side of this massive screen.
Where did you get that phone?
Lucky for you, I don't gatekeep my sources. Tell them.
Get your own Galaxy Z Fold 6 now at Samsung.com. Requires internet connection. Results may vary by uniqueness, clarity, and framing of circled image and related factors.
Starbucks Iced Apple Crisp Oat Milk Shaken Espresso. Made with blonde espresso, creamy oat milk, and spiced apple flavors. It's an icy crisp sip you can enjoy all autumn long. Order ahead on the Starbucks app.
This episode is brought to you by BuzzBalls. Meet BuzzBalls, a unique round ball can that is filled with delicious real fruit juice and cream cocktails. There is nothing cooler than these new ball-shaped cocktails that are perfect for every occasion. Grab a refreshing gluten-free BuzzBalls for your party, festival, or just relaxing with friends. BuzzBall, let the good times roll. BuzzBalls, 15% ABV, Carrollton, Texas. Please enjoy responsibly.
Broadening out, because I think that we've touched on ways in which various players disorder the world in the way that they think will keep it ordered for their interests. I've never been to Taiwan, but I think we're sketching some things about how China is very touchy about what happens in its near abroad, and it's nowhere more touchy than in Taiwan. So what about, Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow? Do you think that we are doing enough to support Ukraine and deter future Chinese aggression in Taiwan? What is your read on the psychology of the Chinese leadership and how all these issues play into their calculus?
So It's hard for me to say if we're doing enough. Of course, what I would have liked to see was a thorough enough spanking against the Russians that they left, and it caused more problems for Putin domestically. I understand why we're not doing that. We don't want to risk nuclear escalation or other kinds of escalation in the region. But, I'm not the president or commander-in-chief, and I'm not the one who's on the front lines, so it's not my decision to make. That said, I think what would have been worse is no or low international response. That would have said to Xi Jinping, hey, you could probably roll in here and nobody's really going to do anything. They're just going to write strongly worded letters and condemn you, and maybe you'll get some sort of minor sanctions that are more symbolic than anything. But now what he sees is, yeah, you're going to have to run this invasion and you're going to have massive casualties. I mean, it's going to be absolutely catastrophic. And by the time you take over anything, the whole place is going to be a total wreck and you're going to have to rebuild it from the ground up. You're not going to have a semiconductor factory with a bunch of employees making Taiwan semiconductors for the CCP. That's going to be in tiny pieces in the ground, and all of those people are going to have fled to the United States and are going to be working in semiconductor factories somewhere in Arizona or Germany or something like that, I guess. And on top of that, you might even get blockaded by Australia and the United States Navy, at which point your population is going to start to go hungry somewhere around the 30 or 60 day mark. And that's not going to be good. You're going to have to import oil in some other way. Pipelines are going to have to get built. That's going to take a really long time. You're not going to be able to import food. You're not going to be able to import ships. You're probably not going to be able to sell things. Yes, the U.S. is going to have a hard time getting cheap crap from Amazon, Temu, and Alibaba. But if we're choking off the Chinese economy, there's going to be regime change, or at least people in the streets, whether they're protesting or starving to death, within a couple of months. And I think Xi Jinping kind of went, oh, okay, if that's what's happening in Ukraine, I've got to roll the dice and figure out what the odds are that this is what would happen in Taiwan. And I think Biden had poked a hole in, I think they called it strategic ambiguity, where it was like, we're not telling you if we're going to support Taiwan, we're not telling you if we're not. And that was a big move, because he sort of said, yeah, we're going to support Taiwan. Now, he either has to go on record as saying, oh, that was a big old bluff, and we're not going to do that, in which case every sort of underpinning of U.S. hegemony and military allies and the whole idea that we're going to protect our allies, that just goes out the window. That's not something the U.S. can afford to do. I think Xi Jinping knows that we know that that's true. And so I think he's probably going to saber rattle, but I don't think he's dumb enough to try to invade Taiwan, especially because there's got to be a part of him that's going, oh, I really thought Russia was more capable. I guess they weren't. Wait a minute. Are we as capable as we think we are? Because we have corruption and crappy supply chain in our military too, and I don't know who's lying to me. So maybe I don't want to roll the dice on this one.
I'm going to draw on an episode we just did with Marcel Dirsus. And we were talking about authoritarian states. He wrote a really interesting book, How Tyrannies Fall. His insight about tyranny is that it's just the people around the leader that matter. The more tyrannical the regime, the less they care about some starving peasant in the periphery. The regime elites and oligarchs, or the securocrats who actually guard the ruler, those are the people that get a vote, quote unquote. I'm wondering, given Marcel's kind of insight here, how can we unpack the psychology of the Chinese leadership? Who are their actual pillars, of their selectorate?
Yeah, I mean, look, as with any dictatorship, the first thing is the military, right? You need the military. The military is not supposed to operate domestically here in the United States. That doesn't matter so much in tyrannical regimes. I mean, that's why you see military, paramilitary, police shooting people in Venezuela, right? Armed militia groups. Maduro doesn't need to win the election. He just needs to say he won the election and then not care about anybody else other than the general that has all the bullets in his storehouses with all his commanders, because that's the guy who decides whether or not the presidential palace gets stormed by either the military or the civilians, or whether people who try to do that get shot down in cold blood in the streets as a warning to everyone else. The sort of stakeholders are always the people with the guns, which is one of the reasons why populations in these countries are typically never allowed to have anything resembling a weapon. And You also can't form an organized group of any kind, even if you're unarmed in a lot of these places without government permission. That's how it was in sort of East Germany as well. What you find is with a lot of these dictatorships is the intelligence service, like in the United States, we have the CIA, of course, and we have the NSA and these other organizations. They're mostly pointed outwards. Like, yes, there's exceptions. We learned that from Edward Snowden. The NSA is sort of ingesting everything, including U.S. domestic information. But in general, these services are pointed outwards, right? They're looking for threats from China, Russia, Iran. Whereas within a dictatorship, the intelligence services, sure, they're focused on the United States and our counterintelligence services, the counterintelligence to our intelligence services. However, what they're really focused on, like where 60 to 80% of their resources are, is monitoring the opposition, monitoring students, monitoring the domestic population, because that's where their greatest threat comes from, not from the U.S. dropping Navy SEALs into Caracas.
This is exactly the point that we talked about with Marcel. And this is historically true as well, that the East Germany that you mentioned, obviously 90% of its intel was on the Stasi spying on its own population. And although we do know a lot about the active measures that the Soviets did abroad, if you look at Stalin's purges and who they were spying on, it's dissidents inside the Soviet Union, right? And this is a principle that I call the endless quest for security. I'm misquoting that famous Nadav Safran book about Saudi Arabia, which is that the more dictatorial a regime, the more it is simply an endless quest for internal regime security. And if I'm going to extrapolate part of what you said there, it's that we need to, when we're looking at China, understand that the key pillars of the regime, some of which are going to be factories and tech people and whatever, are the internal security aspects of spying on and controlling alternative economic centers, alternative political centers. And maybe we don't give enough credence to those little levers that we could have over them when we make policy towards China.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. Again, I'm no expert in that particular area, but it really does seem that one of the major flaws of these authoritarian regimes is they can't afford to let up. The United States can fight wars on multiple fronts. Like, that's something people are always saying. You have to remember, the United States is not fighting a war against its own citizens. And that is a massive advantage, right? Because you look at a place like China and you go, oh, yeah, well, they can't maybe fight a two-front war, but we don't know if they could fight a one-front war and how successful it would be. They're already fighting a one-front war, at least one, right? They've got the Xinjiang, they've got Tibet, they've got all this internal repression of dissidents in every single place, and they're using counterintelligence against, the U.S. and Canada and the West.
So let's order the disorder together. If you could create an institution on the global stage to help us with ordering our current world, what would it be?
I mean, geez, I would probably start with my own backyard. I think a lot of Americans like to go, well, China should do this. Honestly, we need to get some of the big money out of politics because that's where all this conflict of interest type stuff comes from. I think we would have a much easier time with, say, China if big corporations weren't like, or let's look the other way for another decade because we're going to make like $20 billion a year making cheap crap and selling it on Amazon over here. And everyone goes, you're speaking my language, pal. I like pork barrel politics. If we didn't have that, we would probably have a vastly different landscape because at the end of the day, we're empowering countries like China to keep up this kind of crap because we're buying crap from them because we don't want to pay $2,000 for an iPhone. We want to pay $900. And we don't want to pay for the plastic broom to be made in Texas or Mexico. We want to pay for it to be made by slave labor in China and then just not think about it again. That's what we're doing.
And as simple as that is, it's so obviously correct. And this is the way in which neoliberalism is inherently connected to the rise of the disorder, because whether it was cheaper energy that we bought from Russia and the Germans essentially said, oh, we'll look the other way because we can make our cars cheaper if we have this cheaper energy, or the fact that so much of American tech and consumer goods are based on this unhealthy marriage with China. So what I want to say is this a marriage gone wildly wrong? Because you do a little bit of relationship counseling. And are we essentially in a marriage with China where one party has a financial hold on the other, but the other has a psychological hold and no one can kind of escape? And some Western CEOs and politicians are beholden to this relationship where they're getting abused?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Maybe in some ways, yes, sure. Certainly there's some dysfunction in the relationship. That said, I think we have a really important choice in the uncoupling, the breakup, if you will, right? The divorce. It can either be acrimonious and involve lobbing shells over the Strait of Taiwan and sinking amphibious assault vehicles, or it can be what two parents who have birthed something to the world decide to do when they're both a little bit enlightened, which is go, hey, this is really going to hurt, and it can hurt a lot worse if we start screwing around. So we need to figure out a way to sort of like set this down gently and land the plane, because if any one of us drops the ball in order to hurt the other one, we're just going to end up with a massive set of destruction on our hands. Now, are our leaders enlightened enough and skillful enough to do that? That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking my language. I argue that on things like climate change and tax havens, it's not only that we have one world and we have to deal with the people who are in it, but there are aspects to which post-Putin Russians and the Chinese right now, we have the same interests as them. They don't want to blow up the world, and we're going to have to deal with each other. So that aspect of whether you call it relationship counseling or negotiations, yes, you have to find that small bit of the Venn diagram where my interest overlaps with my opponent's interests.
Exactly.
So, last question. Do we need to have the tech bros and the hedge funders have less power and sway over our politicians to make that happen?
Yes, definitely. Look, I love innovation. I'm an entrepreneur myself. I'm a business owner myself. I advise tech companies all the time. Do I think those people should have the amount of political and social societal influence that they do? Not really. No. I live in Silicon Valley. We love to idolize innovators and tech bros. And cool, I like innovation. What I don't think we need to do is elevate these people to godlike status, because they start to believe us, and then politicians and other folks start to act based on that influence that we are giving these people. And we end up with problems like with everything from social media causing massive disorder among our population and making our young people and our adults, for that matter, psychologically miserable, all the way to AI companies that go, yeah, we're carefully monitoring the idea that we might actually just create something that kills everyone. But isn't it cool? It can write a paper for you. It can answer questions like a human. We're giving these people way too much power, way too much influence, and way too much leeway. Again, I'm all for innovation. I'm not saying we need to regulate these people into oblivion, but what I am saying is maybe we don't tell them that they're the best thing since sliced bread.
Wow, that was fun. What a tour de force of stories and insights and deterrence. Who knew that there was someone else who's been kidnapped in a similar way to me and has a mega ordering mind that wants to achieve deterrence against both China and North Korea and Russia? If you have enjoyed today's show, please click follow now and check out the links in the show notes and join our Substack, where we're going to have more information on North Korea and what Jordan has done and some of my favorite of his podcast episodes. As always, our producer has been the one, the only Mega Orderer-in-Chief, George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. And I am hoping that you have a very orderly and well-nourished and non-North Korean week.